Yeah, I'm excited to talk to Drew Dellinger today. I've been enjoying his Substacks. Um, Both of us seem to share a certain level of frustration or feel a little infurious, is that the right word? Around particularly Charles Eisenstein. Since this podcast will ultimately end up also on YouTube, I would remind people that it's really helpful if they subscribe, give it a thumbs up, and all that stuff. The more the merrier. It doesn't cost you anything. It helps us get attention and all that stuff. Yeah, Drew Dellinger. As we wait for people to come in, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Well, I'm a speaker and a teacher and a writer, and I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, originally from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And but I've been in the San Francisco Bay Area for 25 years. And part of what drew me to this area was some of my teachers, particularly Brian Swimme, who was talking about cosmology and talking about the worldview of our culture and kind of what are the deep roots of the ecological crisis. So I was very lucky when I was a young person, around 20 years old, to meet Thomas Berry, who was a great environmental ecological writer and cosmological thinker and kind of an eco-philosopher type. So for the last, 35 years or so since meeting Thomas Berry, I've kind of tried to integrate his cosmological perspective into my work, combine it with my interest in social justice, racial justice. And so I see myself as kind of writing and thinking at the intersections of ecology, social justice, and cosmology or worldview, and trying to bring those together with my other interests in the arts and poetry and things like that. So kind of combining activism, politics, cosmology, ecology, poetry, the arts, that sort of thing. So that's a little bit about myself. I have a little poetry collection called Love Letters to the Milky Way, and I'm working on a long-term book project on Martin Luther King right now, where I look at Dr. King as an ecological thinker, as a cosmological thinker, and as a prescient prophet of interconnectedness.
Very cool. Thank you. Yeah, but I was actually scrolling back through your Substacks. And yeah, I guess, on the election day, you were still pretty convinced the Democrats were going to take it. How have you been feeling?
I wouldn't say that. I mean, I can see why you say that from reading my things. Some of that was, part of politics is you have to embody confidence, and that sort of. If anybody had said, Drew, are you absolutely so I said, I said a couple of things. I do like to be accountable for what I write on my Substack. So I'm happy to be accountable for everything I said. But I did write a couple of things where I said, Donald Trump's in the end of his presidential, in the end of it, the last 48 days of his political life. And, and we're going to take this thing, but it was kind of that kind of, it wasn't, if somebody asked, are you positive the Democrats are going to win? I would say, absolutely not. Yeah. This thing is razor thin. I mean, I was one of the early people in 2016 saying Trump can win.
Yeah.
Before he had ever won a primary, I said, Trump can win this primary. And if he wins the primary, it's automatically a coin flip for the White House, right? So yeah, I said a couple of kind of confidence building type of things, like we're going to win this thing, but I was never it was never a flat prediction that wasn't the kind of rah confidence building that one tends to do in politics. Right?
It makes total sense, of course. Yeah, well, maybe we'll I think I was interested in a recent piece you wrote about kind of the impact of RFK and Charles Eisenstein, and how, in a way, together they may have helped really swing the election. I mean, obviously RFK had a lot more, influence and reach and so on. But yeah, kind of curious about your thoughts around that, and what motivated you to write that piece, and how you're feeling about the situation like right now.
Was very concerned that RFK Jr. could play a spoiler role and tip the election toward Trump. I was concerned about that from the very beginning, as soon as he announced his intent, his campaign. What I did not anticipate, though, was that he would throw his weight in with Trump. I never thought that RFK Jr. would go full Trump. And so when he, said he's going to drop out of the race, I was like, good, this is good. This is good. I thought if Kennedy was in and on the ballot in a lot of states, it could trip tip the election to Trump. Again, repeating myself, never conceived that RFK Jr. would fall in line with Trump, would endorse Trump, and this sort of thing. So the reason why I wrote the most recent piece, which is, I give these long titles because I feel like we live in this scrolling world where sometimes the only message somebody's going to see is the title. And so I tend to give these long titles. This one was called Yes, RFK Jr. and Charles Eisenstein were 1,000% wrong about Trump and Project 2025. And then I put in parentheses, i.e. his entire agenda. I mean, I think that's an important point. To be wrong about whether Trump's going to implement Project 2025 or not is to be wrong about Trump's entire agenda. There's not much more to be wrong about regarding the incoming Trump campaign if you're wrong about whether or not he's going to implement Project 2025. So, but the thing is, when one is writing before an election, one can be tempted to say all kinds of things, and you don't know what's going to come to pass. You don't know exactly you don't know who's going to win the election. You don't know what Trump's going to do if he gets elected. So I just thought it was incredibly irresponsible of RFK Jr. And then Charles to pick it up and to broadcast it out to his, 80,000 readers on his Substack that, Trump said, Trump said he's not going to do Project 2025. I mean, you've got millions of last minute independent voters at the last minute, and they're all getting freaked out when they're hearing, Project 2025. The more people heard about it, the more they disliked it, the more they didn't want to vote for Trump. So it was obvious when Trump said, "Oh no, Project 2025. No, we're not going to do that. I've never heard of it." That was the most transparent kind of rollback and ass covering.
Well,
And
let's.
so, yeah. Just to finish the point real quick, I thought it was remarkably irresponsible for RFK Jr. and Charles Eisenstein to say, hey, look, Trump says he's not going to do Project 2025. He says he doesn't even know the guy involved in it. And so you guys, you don't have to worry. Trump's not going to do Project 2025.
No, I get it. Okay, so let's talk a bit about Charles Eisenstein, because I mean you've really been both of us knew Charles personally. I had a platform, Reality Sandwich. He did a lot of writing for that platform. I really gave him, helped him have a bigger platform at that point. And I also published and edited his book, Sacred Economics. And I was quite a huge fan, although I did early on begin to have a little bit of, kind of worries here and there. The sort of like Sacred Economics, to me, what he actually proposed seemed still very nebulous. And yeah, he felt over time a little bit maybe more about himself than about really trying to like do something bigger. But I never would have anticipated that he would have had this sort of psychological collapse in a sense to end up really supporting this right-wing Trump movement. Although of course he uses kind of sophistry or rhetoric in a way to make it a little bit unclear. And I think, I also didn't like his book Coronation, which I think is when you started also to be like, ring some alarm bells. So let's talk a little bit, like, what's your perspective on Charles? I mean, it's not that he's like, the biggest, fish in the fishbowl, but, maybe a little bit like a trim tab in that, it was Buckminster Fuller's idea that there's like the rudder, which turns the ship, and on the end of the rudder is like a trim tab, and the trim tab turns the rudder, which then turns the big ocean liner. So Charles, having a certain level of reach, and, he'd sort of taken this position of like moral authority in a sense, like people looked up to him as somebody who really was speaking from a truth perspective, who wasn't, kind of like, what wasn't sort of corrupt to like financial stuff and so on. He somehow created this very sort of moral position for himself as somebody that people looked up to in, our extended communities. And therefore, when he kind of opened the gates for, RFK and then for Trump, it did seem, and that a lot of people kind of that he gave an opportunity or an opening for a lot of people, to kind of move in that direction. Is that how you see it? And what do you think happened with him? How do you feel that his, where did he go kind of off in a way?
Yeah, I agree with your analysis for sure. I think it's interesting. I actually was critiquing Charles before the pandemic, though, which I think is interesting because the first time I posted kind of a public critique was after he wrote an essay well before the pandemic called "The Polarization Trap," and in it he was saying, the trap is we're becoming polarized, one against the other, left versus right, this and that, and which I thought was as with a lot of Charles's work, there are good sentiments and some decent intentions, in there. But I thought the way he laid out his argument was false equivalence, to the nth degree. He was in the polarization trap essay. He was at one point he compared people saying that Obama is born in Kenya, this kind of racist birtherism myth that really launched Donald Trump into politics in his most recent incarnation. That was equivalent to, the so-called Russiagate hoax, Russiagate. Well, actually, the Trump campaign had 157 contacts, with people connected to Russia and the Kremlin, whereas the idea that Obama is a foreign usurper born in Kenya is a completely made up racist myth. So I said, I said, I'm concerned about some false equivalence that I'm detecting in this. And so then, as the pandemic comes along, all of these tendencies in Charles's work got amplified, right? It got exacerbated. So this kind of false equivalence, this kind of both sidesism. Again, there's a time and a place to say, look, we all, are involved in this system and you're no different from me. But that can't become a substitute for a realistic political analysis. And this was my concern with Charles's work, is that he didn't have a power analysis. He didn't have a racial justice analysis. He didn't really have a strong social justice analysis, so he would nod in these directions. And I think, what has come to pass. And so to me, it felt like I didn't trust that he was grounded in a real analysis of social justice and power. And guess what? If you can create common cause with this Trump campaign, then I think, my concerns, were realized that he was not grounded in a way. I started my one of my in one of my recent Substacks, I quoted the kind of phrase, the folk wisdom that says, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. If
Yeah.
you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. I felt Charles wasn't clear on what he stood for, and he ended up falling for the Trump campaign.
Well, I think there was, there's kind of two levels. One is, Charles himself as a figure and his kind of journey, and the sort of problematic, kind of trajectory that he's taken, almost like tragic trajectory in a way. But then there's also kind of like him as a kind of, model or exemplary kind of, kind of like how so many people went into this kind of like delusional world. And a lot of people still haven't really come out of it, including from what I can see from his recent writing, Eisenstein, Charles. So, I remember even when he wrote the book on climate, and so many people loved the book, I really did not like that book at all because I felt it was like there was a sort of impulse to just be contrarian, to kind of like want to have the sort of like the master discourse by not going along with what Bill McKibben and Greta Thunberg and everybody else was saying about like CO2 levels, like wanting to say no, it's really about soil and connection, or like sort of really like wanting to find like a high ground above everybody else. And maybe that's part of maybe that's just thinking out loud one of his fatal flaws. I don't know that he doesn't want to be common. He doesn't want to be like, he somehow thinks that he's above everybody else, and therefore he can reach this kind of like plane of kind of like above typical morality, or do you think there's some truth to that there, or is it more venal in some sense?
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. I think there's a kind of reflexive contrarianism, and I felt the same way about the Carbon book. It's, some of the things he was saying was like, look, it's not all about carbon, it's also nature, and we need to save the whales. He literally, at one point I saw him give a talk where he said, we need to save the whales too. And he said, well, actually that was a bumper sticker back in the 70s when I was a kid. And I was like, yeah, it was, because people have been talking about all of these things. People have been talking about the soil. People have been talking about the ecosystems. People have been talking about, the biosystem and biodiversity. And we haven't gotten, environmentalists haven't gotten enough traction for 50 years on any of these things. And we're finally getting maybe a little bit of traction around climate and carbon. And Charles wants to say, whoa, 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 it's not just about carbon. Of course, it's not just about carbon. But any traction that we can get on any environmental, ecological, or climate related issue, I think is a good thing. So I don't think we need to be reflexively, kind of taking this contrarianism pose of, oh, that's not about carbon. Well, yeah, no, it actually is. It's partially about carbon, and it is about
Well, I mean,
biodiversity and all these other things.
yeah, my analogy would be like, if a doctor, has a visit with somebody who, has very, very high blood pressure, is on the verge of a heart attack, you know, certainly there will be like lifestyle factors and, you want them to have a happier life and, not be so stressed about their kids or their job or whatever, stop smoking, obviously. But, the first immediate thing is to get the blood pressure down or the heart rate down. So you'll use drugs or whatever you need to do as an intervention. So, I mean, the 425 parts per million or where we're at now, that we know that is atrocious for the near term future of the planet. So yeah, I mean, you could talk about the other stuff and it's all true, but kind of the way he framed this argument was almost kind of like he wanted to show that he was like above the thinking of somebody like McKibben or something, that he'd found this like higher plane from which to look down upon these sort of more like materialists, environmentalists in a way. you know I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I mean, I try not to get too much into. I do think that there's an attraction in that kind of contrarianism that we see a lot. That I've got to have the different take. That I've got to have. I can't have. I want to get back to carbon for 1 second, but I'll just give another example that I see in this kind of contrarian sphere is like the idea that one could just support the Democratic candidate is not a sexy enough, is not a on cutting edge enough position. Now, believe me, I have plenty of critiques of the militarism, the corporatism, the control of wealth and power between both our parties and this sort of thing. But there's also one multiracial party in this country, and and there's one party that cares about multiracial democracy. But I think the idea that RFK was not going to win the White House, that I predicted from day one, and I'm right about that. So I just think there's a way in which a lot of this kind of, cutting edge contrarian brosphere, it's RFK was the kind of thing that seemed edgy, and like supporting the black women that are the base of the Democratic Party. I'm committed to standing in solidarity with the brown and black women that are the base of the Democratic Party. And until there's a third party, that's can mount a serious challenge. I was a registered Green 25 years ago. So you don't need to tell me about third parties and about the duopoly. I understand all that, but there's not a viable right now. We need people power to take down fascism. And the vehicle for this people power electorally right now is the Democratic Party. So I do think there's a way in which that's not edgy or contrarian enough for a lot of people. But let me just say one last thing about Charles and climate and carbon. You see, I think that kind of contrarian, that reflexive contrarianism can become demobilizing. And let me give you an example. I knew a group that was working on a climate initiative, and they had signed on. They were going to do something having to do with Project Drawdown and and Paul Hawkins' work. And they had this. They'd been working for months and months and months on this whole initiative. And then Charles came to their gathering. I happened to be there, and he gave this keynote speech on Saturday night. And he said, look, it's not all about carbon. And he gave a long example of a synchronicity that had happened to him, and it's kind of the mystery and the miraculousness of the universe. And the next morning, on Sunday morning, they were having all these discussions like maybe we shouldn't do the initiative we were going to do. Maybe we shouldn't do this Project Drawdown project that we had been talking about for the last 5 months because Charles said it's not all about carbon. And I'm just sitting here like, y'all are going to let Charles's random musings on a Saturday night throw you off this climate change initiative that you've been planning on for months. And you see how his message was literally demobilizing in that moment. Right. I think they went ahead and did the project, the climate initiative they were going to do, but they were all confused, for a little while because Charles had said it's not all about carbon. So that was kind of some of my concerns when I say there's a demobilizing aspect to this kind of contrarianism.
And in the last essay that I read, the new one, you used a term that I quite liked, which was epistemological nihilism. Do you want to unpack that a little bit and tell me what you mean by that?
Yeah. Epistemology, of course, is right the study of how we know, right? Epistemology involves how we know anything. Um, and nihilism, of course, I would have to look up the exact word, but it's this kind of apocalyptic, nothing matters, kind of idea, right? So I think there's a consistent strain in Charles's writing that is part, again, very selective. That's part of my critiques of Charles, is that he will say there's no way we can really know anything when it suits his purposes, when he doesn't want to commit to a certain thing. There's other times where he commits to saying, no, we can know this and this sort of thing. I pointed out one of those things in the essay where he talks about Trump. He literally calls Trump a cipher. I'm going like, this guy, it's not always the case when you're considering casting a vote for president that one of the candidates is somebody who has been president for 4 years. And Charles is writing after the first Trump term. Who can really know about Trump? And I think the fact that he had some backroom access, enabled him to kind of puff up this idea that he's seen behind the facade and all of the media narratives, and he's seen the real Trump. It's like, I don't think Charles even followed in 1/10 of the policies that Trump implemented during his first term, but he's going to get on his Substack and tell people that Trump's not nearly as bad as people think he is. So I just think it's and in the essay I said it's typical of Einstein's writing as a whole, that he gets to a point when it suits his needs.
What's that?
When it suits his needs, he gets to a point where you can't tell left wing from right wing. You can't tell conspiracy from myth. You can't tell expertise from intuition, and these sorts of things. And now, believe me, I understand, r- different ways of knowing. And I'm not like a fully materialist reductionist, scientist or anything like this. But it gets to a point when you're dealing in the political realm with real people's lives on the line, that this kind of, oh, how can we really know anything, becomes just kind of a pose or an excuse. Yeah, yeah. Ultimately, we can't know anything, and yet we have to practice some discernment and move forward and try to make positive social change in the real world in the ways that we can.
Yeah, I mean, I guess another question that I have. I mean, maybe it was in some if you believe in Jungian ideas like the shadow, like somehow Charles's shadow, his own trickster shadow, came out and kind of like went against this sort of like moral authority that he'd been claiming for himself, and kind of like almost like sabotaged or surrendered that in order to make the sort of complicit deals with like power and so on. I mean, not that different from what just happened with Bill Mayer, right? Like, he went and kissed the ring of Trump, and he was like, "Oh, he's actually like much smarter than I thought, and he's so cunning and interesting behind the scenes." And it does feel very yeah, like very Manichaean right now, right? Like there's this the seduction of the dark side that so many people are drawn towards, people you never would have anticipated. Even obviously like the Joe Rogans and all these people.
Well, that's one of the issues why this is way beyond Charles to me, because I think we have this, Media Matters for America recently did a study. I mean, it's probably a year or two old now, where they looked at the relative, and there was a chart that was going around where they had
Yeah.
bubbles, big red bubbles for Joe Rogan's podcast, and, little blue bubbles for the few progressive or left-ish or Democratic type voices. There's such an intense narrative dominance, in the podcast sphere, where you have people like Brett Weinstein and Joe Rogan and this kind of intellectual dark web. And you also have I don't know what to do with some of these new people that are on the scene, that I don't really know what their take is. Some people talk about sense making, or talk about, or like rebel wisdom. Let's just use rebel wisdom as an example. I don't know their whole deal. I don't know where they came from. I don't know their ideology fully. I don't know their philosophy. But some people I knew were being interviewed on rebel wisdom, and I went and I looked at the rebel wisdom. I looked at their podcasts, the catalog of all of the people that they've interviewed on their podcast. And I swear to God, I scrolled through maybe pages and pages. So we're talking about 250 different guests that they had on their podcast. There were like 3 African Americans that had been interviewed by Rebel Wisdom in the 250 people or so. And again, these are approximate numbers, so don't hold me to the exact numbers. But it was something like this. Hundreds of people they had interviewed. 3 of them were African American. And the 3 African Americans they had interviewed were all kind of contrarian anti-racist. So you had John McWhorter, who's kind of a contrarian anti-racist. You had this woman named Chloe, I think is her name, who's kind of a African-American contrarian anti-racist. So to me, that just said so much. The idea is this is rebel wisdom and we want the most cutting edge, heterodox thinkers. And they can't find an African-American scholar that they're interested in interviewing. They can't find an African American intellectual or a Afrofuturist, a theorist that they think might have a little bit of rebel wisdom. It's a choice when you live in a country that for 500 years has had the most intense racialized oppression and racist tyranny and racist violence in the history of the planet. And in that context, after 500 years of racist terrorism and oppression, you start a podcast called Rebel Wisdom, and you can't think of a single African American thinker that you feel like interviewing that you think might have some rebel wisdom other than a few that are reflexive contrarians and anti-racist. So that just said a lot to me about where people are coming from and where their blind spots are. And if we're going to have groups like Rebel Wisdom and some of these new sense makers and Brett Weinstein and Joe Rogan and RFK Jr. and Charles Eisenstein, kind of putting out these ideas of like, oh, I can be eco-spiritual and I can be part of this movement and still fall in line with Trump. No, you can't actually. That's why I wrote the last piece that I just posted to Substack in the last day or two is about gatekeeping in movements. If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And we can't have a movement where people say, hey, we can be for ecology and social justice and we can side with Trump and fascism. No, we're not going to have a coherent movement if we think anything goes, right?
Yeah. Well, what else? We've covered Charles a little bit. That was one of the main areas I wanted to like sort of dive in with you. What else has been on your? I mean, you can also ask me a question or two if you want about what things I've been interested in. But yeah. I mean, are you observing? Are you paying a lot of attention now to the Maha and the RFK movement?
Yes, on the periphery, because again, I think that's the leverage point. I think that's the tunnel where people from our progressive, social justice, eco spiritual movements are being funneled toward the right. And, so there's a lot, obviously with the pandemic, there are huge schisms and, and reshuffling and realignment having to do with that, which I find very complicated. But yeah, I follow a little bit. I mean, I just saw that Nicole Shanahan, is saying is Bobby being blackmailed. She just posted that 2 days ago. So so I do follow. I don't follow it closely, but I am very interested in the ways in which Maha. I mean, I got annoyed actually. Where people are going like, "Why are you saying we're aligning with Trump?" Some people in Facebook comments are saying, "Why are you saying we're aligning with Trump?" The thing you're identifying with is called Maha. You can't stand in a rose-colored hat in a sea of people with red hats and say, "Oh, but my hat's rose-colored." No, you're standing in a sea of people with red hats. You can't be part of a movement called Maha and say, "What? You're confusing me with MAGA? Why on earth would you ever confuse MAAH with MAGA?" No, I mean, these people are choosing to stand arm in arm with the most fascist and least competent regime that we've had in American history. And they're going like, "Why are you saying we're right leaning? Why do you think?"
I mean, I guess another skewing point for Eisenstein, to go back to Charles, was the vaccines, which really seems to have been sort of a breaking point for the American psyche, and sort of led to sort of things, sort of like a polarization, kind of like I don't know if you have any thoughts about that whole situation.
I think it's tremendously consequential, but I think it's I, let me say it like this. When I did a post the other day where I said, and the title of it was "More Right Wing Weak Sauce from Charles Eisenstein," posing as balance and wisdom. You know, when I was, I thought very seriously before I said Charles is putting out right wing views, but in my mind that was accurate, and so I posted it. But when I called Charles right wing, and Charles has since, been posting and tweeting and saying like, I don't understand how people who are anti-vax are considered right wing. My calling him right wing really had almost nothing to do with anti-vax. So I just think that is such a complex and complicated ball of wax, in the sense that I believe that vaccine injury probably is a real thing. I believe that there probably are people who have been injured by vaccines, and yet, I'm going to go for the most part with the majority of the public health experts, on the safety of these vaccines. So it's just so to me, that's like, I'm not trying to wade into the middle of the vax or anti-vax debate. I'm critiquing Charles's work from a different place, where I say he's putting out right-wing views because he's normalizing and whitewashing Trump. He's talking about the woke craze, using this white wing framing. He's putting out talking points on abortion rights without really understanding the significance of abortion rights, this sort of thing. So I am not relying on some vax or anti-vax position when I call Charles, when I say that Charles has been putting out right wing views. So to me, the vaccine is incredibly important, and politically, it's massive, but it's just complicated, and I'm not sure exactly what to do with it or what to do about it. But I do think that we need to stay in the reality-based community as much as we can. Now, believe me, there's certain so-called conspiracy theories that I think, that I'm partial towards, and this sort of thing. And I'm happy to, and I read David Icke in the 90s. It's like, there's nothing about this conspirituality stuff that's new to me. There's nothing about these conspiracy theories that are new to me. What was new, and I was amazed that it worked, so I had heard people like David Icke saying for 15, 20 years that, the reptilians control the world, and there's these, cults of, sexual abuse and blah, blah, blah. But around 2015, somebody said, we can pin all that on Democrats.
Yeah.
And we can say it's the Democrats that are running this, these elite, rings of abuse on a global level. And Trump and the Republicans are going to stop this.
Yeah.
That was never anything that I had heard in any of the conspiracy theory. It was always these are elite networks that involve the elites of both parties. But the idea that this could be flipped in a political sense, and that these David Icke and the reptilians could be used to make hay for right-wing extremist fascists and through this QAnon movement, that was bizarre to me, and was startlingly effective.
Yeah, it's interesting that the sort of like the far right reactionary Trump movement has sort of co-opted what used to be kind of like radical counterculture kind of provocation style. So even like Trump posted the picture of himself as the Pope, and I wrote about it, and I was like, wow, like, not that I'm a believing Catholic, I don't even really, religion is not really my thing in that sense, but I even felt like aggressed. Like, it's like, yeah, it's like any institution that anybody has any care about, or anything anybody thinks is sacred, they'll just like dismantle or destroy, but then, or mock or whatever. But I mean, on the other hand, a lot of the, kind of more like radical counterculture people, like the artist Andrew Serrano, who did Piss Christ, or, Jeff Koons, when he did like a kitsch statue of St. John the Baptist, or, Sex Pistols, other punk bands that were very blasphemous and so on. I was like all for all of that stuff. So it's kind of intriguing. I guess it's just a question of power. It's like when when it's a naked bid for power by a group that's already in power. It's different than it's a kind of opposition, from the margins or something. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Well, it's much different. It's much different. And that's one of the problems with people like Brett Weinstein and this kind of analysis, that the left radicals have all the power and this sort of thing. The big difference, I'm not going to defend everything that some social justice activist has shouted at somebody else. We all know that there's, people who take things too far, and we all know that there's rhetorical excesses and this sort of thing. But if you can't differentiate between the power of some undergrads at Evergreen State College and the Texas state legislature or the president of the United States, I mean, they're passing laws that say women who cannot travel out, or cannot cross state lines in order to receive an abortion. This is state power at the most intrusive levels. And you're concerned about what some undergrads at Evergreen State College think. So there's just a complete loss of proportionality. That's the false equivalence. That's this both sidesism. Hey, both sidesism has a place when there are proportional things to talk about on both sides. But when you have this massive disproportionality, and then people are talking both sidesism, and then people are doing this reflexive false equivalence, that becomes very problematic and demobilizing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I guess I was watching, what's his name, Van Jones on the Midas Touch the other day. He's a Democratic political figure and CNN host and so on. And he was talking about how in retrospect, yeah, kind of the left wing, progressive, woke cancel culture, had definitely gone too far, in that it was just like, very strident and, very quick to kind of like wipe out these people, particularly men who'd had long careers, who made some kind of like, transgressions in their past or whatever. Um, and I think that ended up leading to a situation where, you're talking about the media matters chart around the red versus the blue media spheres of influence. A lot of the, kind of liberal and progressive men who might have been charismatic influencers and had like large YouTube followings and all that, were kind of like thrown to the wolves, whether it was like Al Franken or Louis C.K. or even somebody, Joss Whedon or something like. So that also made the space even bigger for the right wing. And yeah, so I think there's a problem. And rhetorically, there was a sense of like this woke progressivism kind of had taken control of the academies, the institutions, in a way that wasn't very pleasant. And there was an overcorrection there. And yeah, we could say that that was, of course, for various good reasons. Um, but unfortunately, that seems to have provided this like massive opening for the other side, which does possess like state power and now military force and all that stuff, to kind of completely go apeshit on us.
Yeah, I think there's truth to that. I'm a little more jaded in the sense that, I'm a student of the civil rights movement, and I've, been following, what would they used to in the 90s call multicultural issues, and what they used to in the 80s and 90s call, what we call it, political correctness, So I've just been through so many rounds of this where you can literally go back in the 50s and the 60s and you can see people making the same arguments that people are making about campus radicals, and this sort of thing. So I'm a little more jaded, I think, to the argument that like, oh, if we just hadn't been so excessive, then they wouldn't have had to do this whole pushback. It's just like I've seen these debates get ginned up and hyped so many times, from political correctness in the 80s to wokeism, and it was political correctness and affirmative action and quotas. Are you going to have quotas? Are we going to have quote? These were the terms we were talking about in the 80s and 90s. And now we're talking about critical race theory and DEI and wokeism and these sorts of things. And yeah, I'm not saying there aren't some problems. I'm not saying there aren't some hella problematic and annoying and cringeworthy, DEI workshops that some human resources department has forced people to sit through. But the idea that this is the massive problem, I think, is spun up by right-leaning and corporate media to become disproportional.
Yeah. I don't know if you're aware that, Peter Thiel, before he got into tech, he was just a right wing ideologue. He ran the Stanford Review and so on. And David Sachs, who's now the AI and crypto kind of guru for Trump, and Thiel actually wrote a book together when they were young in their 20s called The Diversity Myth multiculturalism and political intolerance on campus. So yeah, I mean, they were already kind of like, building this argument around intolerance and their freedoms being impinged upon, I guess, by people from different backgrounds, or diversity or whatever.
What are your thoughts, Daniel? Because you've got so much wisdom to share about Peter Thiel, about this tech influence. I mean, we've never seen anything like the role that Elon Musk has played. It's wildly unconstitutional. It's wildly illegal. You know, Congress sets the budget. He doesn't have the authority. I mean, I like what Rachel Maddow has said, and I know in one of my recent pieces, I said that RFK Jr. has been critiqued powerfully by Rachel Maddow and Lawrence O'Donnell and John Oliver. And I knew there were some people who were going to read that immediately and say, "Oh my God, Drew's citing Rachel Maddow. Wow, he really thinks that Rachel Maddow," this sort of thing. I don't care. I don't care. But I think Rachel Maddow is absolutely correct in a rhetorical point that she's been making. Whereas night after night that she was on the air, she referred to Elon Musk as Trump's largest campaign donor. That's who he is. He has no official role. He has not been confirmed to any, cabinet position. If a Democratic president had let their largest campaign donor, say George Soros or Mark Cuban or anybody else, come in and just dismantle large parts of the federal government unconstitutionally and steal all our data. I mean, who knows what they're doing? It's wildly illegal and unconstitutional. There's never been a role like the role that Elon Musk has played. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about and it becomes very scary, when if Silicon Valley keeps going in this right leaning trajectory, So what are your thoughts on Thiel and Musk and this tech oligarchy?
Yeah, I mean, I guess Teal was the first one to go publicly towards Trump and the right in 2016, and then the other ones kind of joined later, and Andreessen and Musk and so on. Um, yeah, I mean, I talk about this and think about this and read about it all the time. Is it possible that there's like a deeper intelligence, structural kind of shift that's been sort of like, maybe engineered, not to get too conspiratorial, but yeah, this could become very totalitarian and very Stalinist very quickly because all of that data could be used to persecute people, anybody who's not in alignment with Trumpism or Vanceism or whatever it's going to be, and could be used to separate people out at the borders. If you've ever said anything that they don't like or whatever. I think it's very doomy and very gloomy right now, and there doesn't yet seem to be the level of resistance or even an understanding of how to build the sort of mechanism of sustained resistance that we really need right now. So, I mean, I'm looking at trying to get a residency visa in Portugal. I'm not convinced this country is going to be livable in a few years. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, and we've looked a lot at the ideology, the ideological background. I mean, there was a book called The Sovereign Individual that these two kind of like libertarian economists wrote in '97. That Teal wrote a introduction to, and Andreessen says it's its favorite book. They believe that actually the nation state is obsolete, and the future is like privatized, commercialized sovereignty, where you'll have these kind of like city states with corporate overlords. Musk actually just has a long history with this. His grandfather in Canada was one of the main people behind this Technocracy Inc. party, which was seen as a proto-fascist party. And it's actually quite incredible if you go and look at that. Their vision was no more democracy. There was going to be three main regions in the world. Each one would have an engineer, scientist, dictator running it with no input from the people, and it would be the North American technate, which would be from Greenland and Canada down to Mexico, Panama, and so on. It would be the Eurasian technate, which would be Russia down to Spain. Then you'd have the Asian one, which would be the Chinese sphere of influence. So it seems as if Musk is actually bidding to be the king of the North American technate. And I guess the idea would be, I mean, I think they're quite serious about taking over Greenland and Canada partially because even though they pretend that climate change and resource shortages are not a thing, they obviously know those are a thing, and everything is predicated on kind of artificial superintelligence. They want to have immortal life. They want to, have these like superpowers and so on. So that's clear in how this thing is being run is they don't care about the general population at all. They're completely happy if people die young or do whatever. Their motivation is to kind of gain the power of this artificial superintelligence, and probably those northern regions then become the hideouts for the super wealthy as climate change worsens, and already seeing what's happened like LA and North Carolina where you're from. So yeah, I think they have more of a strategic end game and plan in mind than people realize. It's also very annoying for me, like even with the tariffs, which, I mean, the liberal commentators are mostly like Trump is stupid, what a moron, he doesn't know what he's doing. But actually, if the plan is to actually have the US default on its debts and to ruin the middle class, then it perfectly makes sense because these incoherent tariffs mean that nobody can plan for a future. You can't even think about building a company or an industry or something if you don't know if they're going to raise it 50% tomorrow or something. And I know already a lot of people whose like small businesses have collapsed or they're looking at the future differently. So it's an effort to further centralize power and control. And I think they really just don't think that most people matter anymore. That with AI, you're going to be able to things that required like thousands or tens of thousands of people are going to require like 10 people, which Musk kind of demoed with Twitter itself. So the only kind of resistance to that would be a kind of people's movement demanding a new social contract, universal basic income, that really pressured, society on a very deep level. And I think we'll see that. But we also, if you look at Trump's budget for next year, they've scraped, social services, FEMA is gone, all that stuff. Like 75% of the budget is military, police, and security. So they're essentially planning for, massive civil unrest and to have the firepower and the capacity just to put people down, you know. So I think it's very much like a very brutal endgame, unfortunately, that we're looking at right now. And, unfortunately, I mean, and, another whole vector around Musk is, ketamine addiction and, demon possession, spirit possession, if you're into like internal family systems or all that stuff. But wherever these people have gone, it's, and however they've built up their ideology, with people like Curtis Yarvin or the sovereign individual or the network state concept or, effective accelerationism or effective altruism. These are all very convenient philosophies that allow them to feel that they're right in centralizing power and control. So like the effective altruism idea is that, for somebody like Musk, yeah, like maybe he kills all the kids in Africa and 100 million people die in the US or whatever. But if we are able to colonize like Mars and other planets, then he's responsible for trillions of people in the future having incredibly amazing lives. So, he still becomes the greatest person in world history or cosmic history or whatever.
Can I just say that that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, particularly that, and I'm not an expert in this. First of all, thank you for that whole breakdown that you did. Very cogent and very significant and salient. But this idea of effective altruism, and again, I'm not an expert and I'm not going to become an expert because I've glanced enough to know that it's absolute nonsense. But the idea that digital beings in the future are going to be sentient and feel things, maybe, maybe not. I'm highly skeptical. But the idea that we have ethical commitments to the trillions of potential digital beings, that more beings is good, undisputably. And if we could have millions of digital beings that we can be made sentient, that we have an ethical obligation to speculative digital beings in the future,
Or
is nonsense.
or human beings also, if we're the ones who are going to colonize the planets. I mean, he
Yes,
actually
no. I get that you were talking
he
about
gets very
human beings
emotional
on
when he talks
Mars.
about, humans and Mars and all this.
Yes, no, I get that. I was taking it to the most extreme forms of effective altruism debate that I've heard, where literally people are saying we have ethical commitment. It would be nice to save people who are hungry right now, but we need to focus on saving more trillions of digital beings in the future,
Yep.
which is just absolutely absurd. I want to mention one thing before we run out of time, which is the Supreme Court. I don't know of a constructive way to raise this, but I just think, if anybody who's watching this live thinks like, hey, the system's holding for now. There's enough pushback. There's enough resistance. No, there's not. But particularly if we think about what's going to happen when
Oh,
MAGA justice. What's going to happen when Thomas retires and we get another MAGA justice and we have, this, completely unhinged MAGA Supreme Court? That's going to be MAGA and Trumpism potentially for decades and decades into the future. So I think progressives, Democrats, leftists, radicals, independents have to be much more strategic in thinking about the Supreme Court. If I used to say to people like, you're saying you want a Bernie in and you won't vote for the Democratic nominee because you are all in on Bernie. Well, what if Bernie gets in 2024 or 2028? He's not going to be able to do a thing because he's going to be completely hamstrung by a radical Republican extremist Supreme Court. So we have to think on multiple levels. And so I'm just, I don't want to be a doom and gloom guy, but, we don't know if we're going to have another presidential election. I'm determined that we are. But we don't know they've already given them this kind of carte blanche, decide as we go form of presidential immunity. But it's hard to even imagine how much worse things could get, if the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court it's supposed to be three co-equal branches of government, but because of certain Supreme Court decisions in the past, they have basically arrogated to themselves ultimate decision-making power, right? So the Supreme Court kind of has a veto over just about anything else. So a president AOC is going to still be dealing with Trumpism. The president in 2032 or 2036 is still going to be dealing with Trumpism, if you get what I'm saying. So we have to be very smart and strategic. We have to think about the Supreme Court, and we have to think about a united front. This is my plea right now. Planetize the movement, planetize democracy, and we need a united front for democracy against fascism, for ecology and social justice. But we have to put down this authoritarianist front, the threat right now, and we need a united front of progressives, independents, radicals, leftists, liberals, etc.
no. Yes, it's definitely a dicey situation, Drew. We can, it's a little bit of a dark note to leave it on, but the notes are a little dark these days. Maybe we leave it there. We pick it up another time.
Absolutely. Well, let me just end with a little poem that I wrote, and if you don't mind, that I wrote and posted on election day. But also another bright note is the leadership and the commitment that you've shown. I've really appreciated your voice and your posting and your dedication to these topics and to hosting these conversations and moving our dialogues and our discourse and our movements forward. So thank you, Daniel, for everything that you're doing.
No, thanks for that. I've been enjoying your posts also.
You bet. So I'll just end with this poem. It's called To the Quislings. And the word Quisling means like a collaborator. It's basically it comes from like a Norwegian politician who collaborated with the Nazis, and his name was Quisling, right? So this is called, and so here's part of, again, one thing that I didn't anticipate. I knew that Trump 2.0 would be bad, but I did not anticipate all of the tech leaders, Tim Cook and Zuckerberg bending the knee. I did not anticipate ABC News and CBS News, bending the knee. I did not anticipate these major law firms bending the knee. So that was incredibly distressing to me. And it was out of that kind of feeling of distress that I wrote this poem called To the Quislings. To the Quislings. To the Quislings, to the cowards, to those thirsting after power, heaven and history will record what you do. To the obsequious, to the toadies, to the lackeys, to the yes men, to the go along to get along, return on your investment in the fall of Rome you call your home, heaven and history are witnessing. To the Bezos and Zucks, to the Murdochs and Musks controlling our thoughts with trolls and bots, to the fascists who would ruin all the world to rule the ashes, to the vote suppressors, disenfranchisers, and Jim Crow Juniors, heaven and history are recording what you do. To those filled with rage who can't tell this will not age well, to the tuned out, apathetic both sidesers in the middle who won't do a thing because you can only do a little, to the 80 million folks with better things to do than vote, but especially to all of you in powerful positions, the editors-in-chief, the billionaires, the politicians. Heaven and history are recording what you do. The whole world is watching, and the little ones too. History and heaven are recording your example, and the downtrodden, trampled upon masses never stay trampled. So to the powers of the hour, don't be shocked to see 100 million folks standing up for democracy. We can win. We can win. We've got to begin, though. The climate's cooked, the window's closing. Now is the time. We need dreaming, not dozing. To everyone around the world who won't cease to work for workers, solidarity, the planet, justice, peace. Heaven and history are supporting what you do. To those who in the spirit of love are steadfast and brave, history and heaven will remember your name.
All right, Drew. Thank you. Have a great day. We'll talk soon.
All right. Bless you, Daniel.
Have a good night.
Blessings to everyone.
Thanks,
Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Peace.